Hello, everyone, and welcome. We are so glad to have you here for this live session as part of the 11th edition of the Global Fairs by Hired. I'm Kendall, part of the school team at Hired, and I'll be your co-host for this insightful session focused on personality and tests in recruitment. For those of you who are new to us, Hired is a global career hub and then the official career platform of EFMD. We have a global network of business schools and universities, and we work directly with your career centers and employers to help you discover meaningful opportunities around the world. For our fourth webinar of the day, we'll be exploring two essential topics: understanding personality, why it matters in the workplace, and the power of tests in recruitment decisions. Guiding us through this session is Espen Skorstad, CEO and co-founder of FairSight. Espen will share his experience on assessments, tools, and their role in shaping recruitment outcomes. Thank you, Espen, for joining us today and taking us on a deeper look inside of these topics. Before we get started, feel free to enter your questions in the chat functionality, and we will get to them throughout the session when the time permits. With that, let's jump in. Espen, thanks for joining. Thank you all for joining, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Kendall. It's a pleasure to be here. Let me just give a brief introduction to myself. As you said, my name is Espen Skorstad. I am educated as a psychologist ages ago, and I've been working with talent assessment and talent recruitment for maybe 25 years. I've written a couple of books on the topic. I'm doing lectures in some universities and colleges around, and I'm also running a company called FairSight. So I'll just say a few words about my workplace before we start this thing going. So, first of all, FairSight is a company that designs psychological tests and interview guides, cases, and all the methodology that HR uses when they are assessing candidates for their jobs. Our mission in FairSight is to make hiring truly fair. We want to make a more inclusive society through better assessment, and we want to help the companies find the talent unseen. And what do we actually mean by that? Well, what we want to do, or what we really know out of the current situation in the job market, is that there is a lot of, how can we say, unequal opportunities. There's a lot of biases out there, and ideally we would like the candidate to be assessed on the more fairer, from a more fair perspective. As you can see from the screen, there are highly talented who are left outside of markets. It could be related to ethnicity, it could be related to gender, it could be age, or even neurodiversity. And that's something we want to do something about based on scientific psychology and modern technology. So to put this a step forward, what we really want to do could be illustrated by this picture. To the left, you can see a diamond. So what we want to do is to help organizations find the diamonds that other companies potentially might miss out on. And on the right side, you might see some people that you don't necessarily want in these companies, at least not in powerful positions. So we have a sort of twofold approach towards fairness. On the one hand, we want to build a more inclusive workplace, and on the other hand, we take a fairly firm standpoint in the sense that some people potentially might be kept out of certain positions. I've also written a couple of books related to this. Unfortunately, these are Norwegian titles, but they're both related to the topic you just saw. One is from a more inclusive perspective regarding recruitment, and the other is about narcissism, related to some people that potentially might be avoided. And I think these two pictures, or perhaps we should go back to this picture, illustrates a bit about what I'm going to speak about today. Because we're going to divide these sessions into two parts. And one part will be related to personality at work and how it matters. We will look into our typical personality. So there you might think about that as the diamonds, but we will also look about the more problematic sides of personality, or what I've called today as atypical personality. I'm happy to take questions along the way. If there are too many, I might have to move them till the end. It depends on the amount, but I'm sure we're going to sort that out. All right, so let's have a look at our more typical personality and why this matters at work. Now, people associate personality with a lot of different things. I think most people think about it as our identity. The typical definition of personality is our typical way of thinking, feeling, and behavior. And of course, this is also related to how we are doing our work. When it comes to the different approaches, it's quite certain that it helps us predict, to say something about how we act in different situations. So let's say that if you meet a fellow student or a neighbor today, and that person is talkative, extrovert, and energetic, you might expect that that person is acting in a sort of similar pattern tomorrow. So it's personality is fairly consistent. It's not 100% consistent, because it's also influenced on episodes that we might had at that particular day or something. But as it say on the slide here, it's fairly stable over time. And there is one model in personality which we call the 5-factor of personality. And some of you guys might be familiar with this already, but it basically means that we're splitting personality into 5 general factors. Here they are called openness, conscientiousness, agreeableness, emotional stability, and extroversion. And this means that these topics, or these 5 factors, they seem to work globally, they seem to work across cultures, they seem to work across age groups, etc., etc. And they say something about what I just said, how we think, feel, and act in different situations. So let's spend a couple of minutes in diving into what's this actually all about. So with regards to openness, it's split into 2 subtopics. One is called intellect, and one is called open-mindedness. So basically it says something about how open we are into new ideas, challenges, meeting new people, coming from different cultures or different backgrounds and all that. So when I started working in this field, when we tried to measure openness, we could design questionnaires whether people were traveling to exotic places or if they ate spicy food and things like that. And of course, that doesn't say much about how open you are today. It did maybe 25 years ago or 20 years ago, but today we have to figure out, what defines openness in 2025. And that's definitely different from 20 years ago. So we'll need to adapt how we approach these matters. Conscientiousness in the middle on the top, that's about how hardworking we are, but it's also about how structured we are. So they're called, in this case, there are 2 subtopics called industriousness. It means how hardworking we are, how much time and effort we spend at studies or work. And the other thing is how well organized or structured we are. That is more related to our planning skills, whether we show up on time, how we prioritize things, etc., etc. Below, we have agreeableness, which is more about empathy and compassion, politeness. And then we have emotional stability, which is about our, anxiety levels and how we appear in different situations, how neurotic or nervous we might be, and all that. And finally, we have extroversion, which is also split into two topics, and not everyone is aware of that. And I spent a few seconds on that as well because I think it's important. On the one hand, extroversion is related to enthusiasm, how talkative and energetic and lively we are, but it's also related to how assertive we are, which is more about social boldness. And there are research showing that, the enthusiasm aspect might be important for some jobs, whereas the assertiveness might be important for some jobs. And it's quite important to distinguish between the two of them. And all this sort of splits of different, underneath extroversion, for instance, is it's empirically researched, and there's tons of research backing that up. What we should look into also is how can we actually measure this? And this is hyper relevant for basically everyone who's applying for a job these days, because you will most likely meet questionnaires of this kind, and then you will see them in two different versions. So I'm just introducing quite shortly our two versions at the moment, because at the right on the screen you can see how this could look like on your cell phone. And there you have 3 questions, or items as we call them, presented at the same time. And what you're supposed to do here is that you're supposed to pick the one who you prefer the most, and which one you prefer the least. And then you will leave one of them open. So this takes an assessment like this takes approximately 20 minutes. It gives you a certain quite detailed impression of personality, and it's quite commonly used, especially amongst HR and recruitment agencies. There is also a shorter and lighter version of personality instruments, and they look more like the one you see to the right here. Here you have one question which says, I spend a lot of time planning my career. And then you have 5 different alternatives, whether you disagree or agree to that statement. The advantage from the employer's perspective by using this kind of questions, where you have 3 items to choose between, is that they're quite hard to manipulate. So you would basically see no faking, because the candidates cannot sort of imagine what the employer is looking for, whereas this type is more candidate friendly. However, it's also slightly more easy to fake. So if you want to present yourself as very, very planning, you would, of course, reply strongly agree to that. Now, there are some control mechanisms to detect whether candidates are faking or not. So my advice to you guys would be most likely to try to avoid that. It's not a very good idea. Every candidate who has completed questionnaires today should get a feedback. That should either come automatically after completing a questionnaire, like in this example. Sorry, I thought this would be a video, but it's not apparently. And but the short version here is that you will get your personality results presented immediately after completing the questionnaire, so that you as candidates get the same information as the employer. The way the information is presented, however, is slightly different. So for the students or the graduates, it's in this case written as a text, whereas for from the employer's perspective, it's more written as, bar charts or different kinds of illustrative models, where you as a candidate typically are compared to a relevant reference group. That reference group could be someone from your country, it could be someone from your same age group, or it could even be a group of global graduates. Now, let's take a quick breath, or perhaps even a sip of coffee, and look into another topic which I have been deep diving into quite a bit for the last couple of years. And now we're talking about the atypical personality, the personality that don't necessarily show up every day, but the type of personality that shows up when we are stressed, under pressure, or perhaps even bored, and all that aspect. So we're now going to have a look at the more problematic sides of our personality. And the 5-factor model, here written as an acronym FFM, which we had a look at a few minutes ago, that describes our typical personality, here illustrated by the green color. Now we're going into the more atypical personality, or what we tend to call our blind spots, which could potentially be problematic at work. It's not, however, entering the, what should I say, the more red aspect of this arrow, because then we're more into topics that potentially do not relate to the workplace, but more into the more clinical aspects of psychology. And then we're more into pathologies of personality issues, like personality disorders, which some of you might have heard of. And we're not going into that field at all. However, we'll focus a little bit on these yellow aspects, the potentially problematic issues, if not dangerous. It could also be illustrated like this. Let's take narcissism, for example. You could have a little bit of it, or you can have a lot of it. A little bit of narcissism does not have to be a big problem. It could even be an advantage in certain situations, but if you have a lot of it, it could potentially become a massive problem. Now, when we talk about problematic personality, atypical personality, or even dark personality traits, as some call them, it's not only related to narcissism. There could be a lot of topics linked to this. It could be people who are hyper-focusing on rivalry to be better than others. So the only thing that's in their mind is to be better than their fellow student or their fellow employee. And some of you might have seen this television series called Succession, where the Roy family is gathering at a ranch in one of the episodes. And because there are so many problems in that family, they have to enter family therapy. Now, this is the picture you see in front of you is the father of the family, the pater familias. And when they are entering the family therapy, his daughter, Shiv, she says, "I bet dad is going to try to win therapy." And then you might ask yourself, why on earth would someone try to win a therapy? That's not exactly the point with therapy. But some minds are only focused on rivalry and being the best person. In some situations, it might be a problem. Another topic might be envy. It might be that you are envious of others, or that you're particularly concerned about people being envious of yourself, or even externalization, which is related to blaming others for everything wrong that's going on. But if something goes well, it's your how do you say it? It's your effort that's the reason for everything that goes right, whereas everything goes wrong, someone else's fault. Exploitation, of course, is not good at work. We don't want to. We ideally want to avoid that. And altogether, psychologists, or the mentality related to people who think that I'm great and you're not, is something we potentially might want to avoid. So then the question is, how on earth can we measure this? So you remember we showed you some questionnaires a moment ago where we measured typical personality, but how on earth can we measure the more darker sides of personality? Well, we could make some fun of it and take a look at, the methods that definitely doesn't work. And here is one example. Well, scientists have announced a new unit to accurately measure narcissism, the selfie per hour measure. And as you can imagine, that doesn't work very well. So we need to take a look at what really works better. And I think the method that deserves an applause are obviously psychological tests, structured interviews, and background checks. We'll spend a couple of minutes on how we can assess this through tests right now in the first session, and in our next session we'll look into some alternative approaches which you also will most likely meet as job applicants. But first of all, let's take a look at one measurement of dark personality traits when it comes to testing. Here is an example from an assessment tool which is called Blind Spots. It's measuring somewhat deeper than the 5-factor model, so it says here to the left that it's measuring deep personality, helps key personnel to recognize potential risk behavior. And this tool is used to reduce risks in hiring. And if we move over to the right to the screen, you can see a cell phone with an example of questions that you might get as a candidate. Morning emails sometimes shape the rest of my day. And then you are rating this question as the one we saw in the past, from strongly agree to strongly disagree. And other items might be things like, when I'm collaborating with others, I'm typically the most important person. Or things that's related to empathy, communication styles, how you approach other people, and a lot of them would be related to how you relate, basically how we deal with others. When it comes to the results, one thing is the perspective that you might see as candidates. Another aspect of it is the aspect that HR or the employer will see. So in this case, they will see something different from you guys, and I think it's important for you to get to know that. So in this case, let's say that John Smith has completed some questionnaires. He has done an ability test. He's done a personality test. He's been through an interview. We can see some figures on the top of this dashboard. But then we also have some dashboards. And it displays a certain risk. There is a red flag there. Let's dive into and see what that is all about. Oh, sorry. That was not, I forgot that we were not able to see the video. All right, I'll try to explain it. When you click on the details here, what you actually will see is some bar charts. And since I've seen this a few times before, I can describe it quite well for you. It gives you some bar charts. And in this case, the red flag indicates that this person is way more dominant than what we ideally want. So it means that we're talking about an individual who on the one hand is quite charismatic, but on the other hand is taking too much space in collaborations, not able to listen to others, do not take expert advice or listen to expert advice, but tend to prefer his own solutions. So there are some strengths there. There's a lot of charisma, but there is also a lot of dominance. And we need to be aware of that. And that's what the employer will see in this case. All right. We're about to reach the end of this first session. So I'm actually open for questions. I can see the text, so I'm able to ask, Kendall, but I think I saw your mouth move as well. So if you said something, I cannot hear you. I can hear you though.
Okay, here we are. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Espen, for the first part. We have a couple of questions we'll go through, and then we'll dive into the second part. Is there a way we can try these tests for ourselves to be more self-aware?
I think that should be possible. If some of the guys that hired are willing to support some of the administration, we should be able to do that for free, no problem whatsoever.
Stay tuned to our hired users. We will notify you when this is possible. Another relevant question, is it a risky move to embrace your true self rather than relying on tests to alter who you are?
Oh, well, I have to read that question once again. Is it a risky move to embrace your true self rather than relying on tests to alter who you are? I'm not sure if I get that question. So maybe it could be rephrased, or maybe perhaps even you, Kendall, could help.
Yeah, I guess like this individual is kind of maybe going along the lines of predicting what the recruiter would want to hear and going
I
down
get
that
it.
way.
I get it. I get it. Yeah, no, that's a good question. Should we try to manipulate these questions slightly or not?
Mm-hmm.
On the one hand, people who apply for jobs are in a setting where they want to show their best self, and they definitely want to show their good sides. At the same time, I think it's a bit of a challenge if you try to fake the tests too much, because it most likely will show up either in a feedback conversation or at work at a later stage. So I think it might hit back to you. So my clear recommendation would be to try to be honest.
Okay, thank you. 2 more questions have come in. Is it easier for you to read, or would you like me to read it to you?
I can read it.
Yeah.
Would you say it's important to reevaluate an employers after a couple of years in the company? You might want to measure whether their tenure is in the company has somehow changed their personality. Oh, cool question. Another cool question. I don't think there's a clear yes or no to it. However, with regards to personality, we tend to see that the personality is quite stable across time. So, let's just use a simple example. Let's say that I'm quite organized today, and most likely I will be an organized person across different jobs and different job roles. However, my behavior might change according to the culture, the climate in the company, or the tasks I'm doing, or even the role. So I think it's not necessarily that important to check personality, but it might be important to check behavior. And that's two different things. So I might be well organized, but I might have a role in a company where that's not really appreciated, so it's not able to blossom. So I think maybe not that necessary.
And finally, we have what is your advice to be comfortable in front of the cameras and avoid losing your thought process?
Interesting, because you have, of course, the online interviews, and you're doing these online. To be frank, Mohammed, I don't have any super advice for you there except practicing. I think that's the most important thing. Try to search up different kinds of solutions where you can practice upon it. I know there are some sites for that. I don't have them in my mind, but if you reach out via LinkedIn, I'll show you a list of at least 10 such sites where you can do some practice to train on it. I think it's a super essential and important question, because what we want to do is that we want you to be comfortable and focused, and we don't want to measure whether you're stressed or not.
Can personality type affect our performance and productivity?
Absolutely.
Is there a way to develop ourselves by identifying these personality traits?
Absolutely. I'll come back to that in the next session. I think I have a very crowded slide. I hope you'll be able to follow that, but I'll try to come back to it.
And we have one more. Sandra says, thank you very much for this session. And she's very interested in psychological targeting and all psychological insights. What do you think of this?
I'm not. It's probably related to my lack of English skills. But what is psychological targeting? Do you know that? Is it the sort of thing that's well? My question is it related to the thing that you will see in crime or that kind of work, or is it more related to job work?
Let's see if Sandra can explain more through the chat, and then I'm sure we can revert back to Espen when that comes through. So thanks, Sandra. That's all the questions I see for now. So why don't we get started on part 2?
All right, cool. Thanks, guys, for all the questions. Encouraging for me as well. Appreciate it. Okay, let's move on to take a look behind the scenes, because one thing is that what you guys are actually seeing as the job candidates, you meet these interview systems, you do the questionnaires online, etc., etc. But what is happening at the other side of the table? What are the employer looking into? So first of all, the way people use tests depend a bit on where sort of you are in the recruitment funnel. So if you look into this model, you could imagine that at the beginning of a funnel, a company might have quite a lot of candidates. It depends a bit on where you are in the world and how many applicants there are. And as you can imagine, this is also related to the population in your culture or in your country. So we do know, for instance, in China, there are obviously a lot more candidates than you would find on Iceland. Now, you don't have to be Einstein to understand that. But there are also certain companies that are more popular than others. I remember, for instance, we used to work with an airline company called Emirates, and we had 1.1 million applicants per year for Emirates through our systems. And obviously, the Emirates cannot speak to 1.1 millions, so they have to use some sort of technology. And initially in the funnel, you might have some methods, whereas you have different methodologies later down in the funnel. And we're going to take a bit of look into that. Now, please excuse me for this slide because it's absolutely the most crowded slide on my presentation. What it actually shows is the so-called predictive power of the different recruitment methodologies. And if we look to the left, we can see that it starts on top by structured interviews, followed by ability tests, work samples, personality questionnaires, etc., etc. And at the end, you can see reference checks, assessment centers, works experience, etc., and so forth. And what it basically says is that the best tools out there are structured interviews and ability tests, followed by work samples and work-related personality. And that is important for you to know because we have spoken about personality, but most likely you will also meet, at least if there is a professional employer involved, what we call structured interviews and ability tests. And it's important that you know what this is about. Now, what the employer is doing is that they're doing, before you meet any sorts of methodology whatsoever, they are doing what they call a job analysis. And a job analysis is about figuring out which tasks, which skills, and which methods, what is the person going to do in that job? So let's suppose you're applying for a consulting role in PwC or as an engineer in a tech company or a sales role or whatever. They will try to define these tasks and which skills you need to do that job properly. And when they've done that, they would figure out, how can we measure this? How can we try to measure this? What kind of methodology is the most effective way of measuring sales skills or coding skills or communication skills or whatever? And then what they typically do is that they try to figure out what kind of characteristica, let's call them people characteristica, or what kind of personal competencies outside of the stuff that you'll find on an application form, outside of what you will see on a CV, is crucial. So let's assume that we have someone who is going to be a salesperson. Let's do that as an example. They will try to pick maybe 4 or 5 out of these, maybe 6 from a competency model such as this. So it could be, if we look, over to the right, taking initiative might be a good thing, maybe enthusiasm. If we move slightly to the left, maybe some planning, maybe some digital fluency, being able to work in a CRM system or something like that. If it's complex sales work, maybe they need some expertise. Let's take a look at the one in the middle here, connecting. Obviously, communication is important, maybe networking, collaboration. If they work in a global company, maybe cultural humility is important, and so forth. So this is what they're actually looking into, stuff like this. How can we prioritize? What is most important for this particular role? And the second question is, what is good enough? How good or how smart does a developer have to be, to do our sort of coding? How intelligent do you have to be, for instance? And then we're into, basic statistics. Is average enough? Is it good enough to be below average? Or does the person have to be above average? And I think this is quite important for you to know, because sometimes when you meet assessment tools diving into this, a lot of people tend to think that you have to be super strong. My experience in a lot of places is that average is good enough. But it depends on the job, of course. I mean, if it's super, super, super complex jobs, they ideally want someone who's well above average. But if it's less complicated, you can might as well be below average. So that's at least that's slightly comforting for me. I've been working in different jobs and basically assessing programmers and psychologists for my own company. And we always had a 3-digit amount of applicants to the different roles. But still, we were never looking for people who were, for instance, in terms of abilities or intelligence or whatever you call it, we were never looking for, if it was average, it was normally good enough. So it's not like we were looking for Einstein. Because ability tests is one of the tools, together with structured interviews, that have the strongest predictive power. And what is actually abilities? Well, it's about our able to solve new problems in new situations. We're separating general mental ability, which could be described as our overall processor, or intelligence if you like, or we could split it into more specific abilities like working memories, numerical abilities, logical reasoning, etc., etc. And this, like personality, is mostly stable across our lifespan. And unfortunately, I said it's mostly stable, and unfortunately, at least for me, we tend to reach a peak in our late 20s, and then it flats out. And when we maybe reach 60s or 70s or something like that, it tends to fade slightly, especially our working memory. How much information are we able to keep in our mind at the same time? And now you might think that this is perhaps more important for, certain positions than others, but actually it tends to be quite important across roles. And I've seen the use of ability tests on all sorts of positions. And I've had the pleasure of working with companies like all the big banks in the world, or the airline companies, the big tech companies, etc., etc. But it's not only important for those. For instance, when I used to work for Manchester United, which is, some of you might know, as a Premier League football club, we also measured their cognitive abilities on the players, to see how much information they're able to grasp on the football field, how they were, able to detect different movement patterns, what we call spatial reasoning, how their mental speed was, how fast their visual scanning was, etc., etc. And all of this is predicting performance also as a football player. So it tells us that these cognitive abilities, despite that the tests might look a bit strange, they are important and they predict job performance, as it's said to the left. The strange thing is that they have a fairly low face validity. They look a bit weird. If not as the Rubik's Cubes, there might be figures, or there might be some mathematical calculations, or there might be some sentences you should try to interpret, etc., etc. People might find them a bit strange, and they wonder why on earth do I have to complete this kind of tool? I'm applying for a job at McKinsey. I'm not going to sit there and do Rubik's Cube, So then it's important to know that the whole idea is to try to measure your problem-solving skills. And these tools, interestingly enough, is a stronger predictor of performance at work than your grades out of college or university. I assume some of you don't like me saying that, but that's the truth. And guys, that some of you are spending 16 hours a day working at school, whereas others are spending 5 hours a day. And if you have two persons, one spending 16 hours and the other spending 5, getting the same grade, it says a bit about the capacity. So grades are important, but other things might be even more important. We also need to spend some time on the job interview. And I said that the structured interview was quite important. And this is something that I really would like to underestimate and get you to get familiar with, because the interview is the most common method. Everyone uses the interview, and it seems that the information that the employer gets from the interview seems to dominate when they are making their hiring decision. There is a good thing related to it. It's flexible. They can validate the information. The employer can observe the candidate. That can build some sort of relationship around it. However, it also has some weaknesses. It's fairly subjective. Certain competencies are not easily identified. Let's think about coding, for instance. How on earth should we assess that through an interview? You could ask someone, are you good in this or that language? And they will might say yes or no, but it's not good enough. It's not like a specific measurements. And also people who are verbally strong make a better impression, and it takes a lot of time. There are also some pitfalls related to the interview. I skipped that slide because it takes a bit too long time, but it's like, you might have first impressions are very strong. People tend to favor candidates whom they like, who coming from the same background, same culture, etc., etc. So there's a lot of what we call adverse impact or unequal opportunities related to the classical interview. Instead, we have to make the interview structured. So let's prioritize that and look into what you should focus on when you train or practice for getting a job, and that is this methodology. So a structured interview is a standardized method for evaluating a candidate's competency, where all the applicants receive the same questions, they get the same instructions, and they are also evaluated by some standardized criteria. It can look like this. Let's start with the one to the right. Tell me about the last time you assumed the leadership in a group. What did you do? What was the outcome? Is there something you would have done differently in hindsight? Now, this is a question that dives into your specific past. You might also have a structured interview which is situational and more future-based. It could look like the following. Imagine working at a preschool. You see 2 children playing and you're refusing a third to join in. What do? One question. And the second one, the parent of one of the 2 children arrives. What do you then do? So if we take a look into the behavioral past-oriented question, those have some, I would say, stronger evidence, scientifically evidence, to be more predictive and better than the situational. And the reason is that when we're looking into past examples, we tend to get more honest descriptions. Whereas if you have the situational questions, people tend to resonate. It's more about your ability to resonate. So, intelligent people, they will identify what would be the sort of correct answer, whereas the others do not. So it does not necessarily measure the competency that we're trying to assess as such, but more your reasoning level. The strengths about these questions are that the questions are directly based upon the job analysis, and the interview is fair for all candidates as they're asked the same questions. They're quite easy to prepare for, and they're twice as predictive as unstructured interviews. And the unstructured interviews, that is like the typical conversation, when you arrive at an employer and they will, ask about this and ask about that. They don't have a particular interview guide. They rather have a sort of what looks like a normal conversation. And it sounds a bit strange maybe, but if the interview tends to move a bit like a normal conversation, it's most probably not a good interview. Because the good interviews, the professional interviews, they are different from a normal conversation. Instead, it's like this. The questions are about examples from your past. Tell me about the last time you assumed leadership in a group. And then you'll say, well, I'm a student. I don't have much experience. So I haven't really attended any leadership positions. And then the interviewer might say, okay, but perhaps there was some situation during your 3 years at school this or school that, where you work together with a group and you assume some leadership. And then you try together maybe to find an example, and most likely you will find an example. And then we can dive into the specific example and what did you do, what was the outcome, and what did you learn. So that's a typical example. Here are some other examples, and I really want to show you this because you will be faced with them sooner or later. Here, for decision making, please describe a recent situation. Please describe a recent decision you made where you consider multiple perspectives, such as different departments or individuals. What did you do? What was the result? What did you learn? Now, I would say that is a bad question for graduates. Let's see if we can find another one. Okay, the next one could work for graduates, perhaps. Describe a situation where you made a decision that had significant implications for others. What was the background? What were the consequences of making a bad decision, and how did you reach the decision? Let's have a third and last example from communication. Let's take the bottom one on communication. Tell me about the last time you were presenting a topic and you got a difficult question from your listeners. What was the question? Why was it challenging to answer? And how did you address it? I think it's super important that you practice on some of these examples. And that means that if you're attending a job interview, you should try to think about some situations at your school, in your weekend jobs or whatever, where you have some situations. So specific situations that you've been in that you really want to tell your potential employer about, so that you have these particular examples and that you can build upon them in that conversation. All right, let's see here. Now my computer is hanging a bit. Okay, that went a bit fast. Let's see. All right, there we go. Sorry for that. My mistake. On the employer side, what they are doing is that they have some evaluation criteria. So the moment that you have left the room, they will start into checking whether you had, how were your communication style? Were you, communicating clearly or correctly in writing? Communication clearly and correcting orally, making well-structured presentations, etc., etc. So they have this organized, predefined criteria, which is good because it ensures objectivity and an equal treatment of all candidates. And it's also fairly easy for the employer to do. All right. I think it's about time to wrap up and check out if you have some questions to this or to me.
Up. Okay, thanks, Espen. We are in time to wrap up. There was one comment, two comments. One was, here comes from Patty. Do you think that emotional intelligence is a trait, an ability that should be present in all job occupations? How would you measure that?
It's a good question, but it's a difficult one because the entire concept about emotional intelligence does lack a bit of scientific evidence behind it. It's a popular concept, but it's if you ask an expert, they would say it's a trait. It's not an ability. It's more related to personality, and why they have put the word intelligence after it, I don't know.
Okay.
Important for a lot of jobs, yeah.
On that note, if you have further questions, I encourage you to connect with Espen on LinkedIn. He's there. And we must wrap up at the moment, but before doing so, thank you so much, Espen, for your insight and joining us to share this knowledge. To all of you, thank you for attending, and we hope you walk away with a deeper understanding of how assessments and personality can really help you in thriving in your long-term job roles. Do not go anywhere. We will be running our next webinar starting at 1 o'clock sharp, where we'll be welcoming Solveig for digital transformation and the journey ahead. On behalf of Hired and FairSight and Espen, thank you once again for being here.